Let's talk a little more about your personal story. You decide that you've got to do this. You asked 27 countries for asylum.
People are, shall we say, less familiar, particularly now with 7 years of distance between it. What exactly happened in 2013? So I left the United States and met with journalists in a hotel room in Hong Kong. Hong Kong was selected because it was a kind of no man's land that had very good media access. It had a largely unfiltered internet, neither of which is true today, unfortunately. But it was very easy for journalists to operate. It was very easy for me to access as a U.S. intelligence employee without popping up on any radars or anything like that. And I would meet with them there. And China also would not necessarily be free to operate against us, particularly in the way they can today, because of rivalries and friction and bureaucratic infighting between the local Hong Kong services and the Beijing government. So this was really an ideal kind of no man's land in which to operate. I provided them with documents and explained the significance of them. And I didn't publish any documents. This is important for people to understand. I didn't put anything online. I instead told the journalists to look through this, explained it, and if they felt, as I did, that this was in the public interest to know, they would need to make an independent editorial judgment that this was the case, go to the government in advance of publication, give the government a chance to argue against this, say that Snowden guy's crazy, or he doesn't understand this, or this document's incorrect, or if you publish this, people will get hurt. Basically, give the government the best chance to argue against this, which the government took in almost all cases that I'm aware of.
And they talked to the White House and talked to governments.
Talked to the White House. Exactly. What happened was, as I mentioned before, I had a decade's worth of history, and actually more than a decade's worth of history, of cases to look over. I looked at Daniel Ellsberg in the case of the Pentagon Papers in the 1970s, and the injunction against the newspapers working with him, how that was resolved by the courts, what that meant. I looked at the case of Thomas Drake, how even though he went through the right channels, he ended up at the same place where his story, unfortunately, didn't get out. He faced enormous consequences. Policy and the public were unable to grapple with this very important issue because of the government suppression of it. And then I looked at the case of WikiLeaks and Chelsea Manning with the Iraq and Afghanistan war logs. And one of the interesting things against this was Manning, of course, was arrested. And they said, Manning had blood on her hands, cost the lives of all these soldiers. And, publishing this material, which was only secret, not top secret, was going to cause basically the atmosphere to catch fire and the oceans to boil off. And none of this happened. And in fact, at Manning's sentencing, the judge specifically asked the government, do you want to argue that people were harmed as a result of this? Do you want to say, someone was hurt, someone died, anything like this, because we'll take it into our sentencing consideration and give a harsher sentence? And the government said, actually, no, we can't show that. It doesn't exist. And this is what we saw actually in the case of Ellsberg. It's a constant refrain where the government goes, whenever they're put in the hot seat, they don't want to talk about the concrete harms of their policy. They don't want to talk about how they violated rights. They don't want to talk about how they broke the law. Instead, they want to shift the conversation to the whistleblower, to the source of the disclosure. Say they're weird, say they're disloyal, say they have problems, say they shouldn't have done this for whatever reason.
Say that you're going to get spies killed or you're going to reveal troop movements.
Precisely. What they want to do is talk about the theoretical risks of journalism in an open society instead of the concrete demonstrated harms as documented by the government's own malpractice. And so this was something that I anticipated. This was why this sort of process was designed. I used 3 different journalists at 3 different outlets. They could all go to the government. The government would get a chance to do this. So we could demonstrate we had gone in theoretically the most responsible way. We had done everything the government thought was proper and appropriate as compared to prior cases, and see if it made a difference. And the interesting thing is, even though this was sort of tremendously indulgent of the government's interests, it didn't make a single change in their messaging. They used the same rhetoric against me as they did with Manning, as they did with Drake, as they did with Ellsberg. But from here, I left Hong Kong en route to Latin America. And I tell this story in my book, Permanent Record, how it happened. But as I was leaving Hong Kong, the government, we're not sure. There's no true way to know whether this was an intentional strategic decision or whether they panicked and it was just a mistake. But once they learned, the government had learned that I had departed Hong Kong, they canceled my passport, which meant I couldn't leave Russia. And I spent the next, 30 days and 30 nights, basically, trapped in this Russian airport, Sheremetyevo, trying to get asylum from, as you said, these 27 different countries, things that Americans wouldn't be particularly concerned with, Germany, France. And every time one of these countries would appear to be leaning towards granting asylum, saying, okay, come here, they would get a phone call from one of two people, then Secretary of State John Kerry, or soon to be possibly, then Vice President Joe Biden. And this is the interesting thing. Why would the U.S. government work so hard to keep me trapped in Russia rather than allow me to go to a jurisdiction where they would be much freer to operate and much more comfortable, realistically, like France or Germany or Iceland or something like that, if they had even the slightest doubt about my loyalty? And this is a question that even to this day I have difficulty answering.
I would assume they just didn't want you to go anywhere. And you happen to be in Moscow. They didn't think it through.
Right. Imagine you're the director of the NSA or you're the CIA. And you've got this guy out there. And he's the person that you hate the most in the world. And you know all your authorities. You know all your incredible powers. You know even the things that I didn't know with all of my access, right? All the ways you can get people. And then you go, we really don't like this guy. We really want to do something about him. Would you rather me be in Moscow or literally anywhere else? Right? And so to me, it's very strange that the government worked quite hard to keep me exiled specifically in Russia. And I've always been a little bit, particularly as years have gone by and you can't explain it away simply as a mistake of policy back then. They've had time to rectify it. They realize that me being in Russia provides them with an evergreen political attack that doesn't have to be explained. It doesn't have to be justified. Simply the association with Russia is enough for them to call into question my character.
And some Americans would say, really? He went to China? And admittedly, it was Hong Kong and different then, and Russia, these two countries, and there was no other way to get to Latin America except through Russia?
Right, certainly. And this was subject of much debate, and it was, again, borne out. There was a lot of public reporting on this back in 2013 when it was contemporary. The reality is you can't fly from Hong Kong, or at least couldn't fly from Hong Kong at the time, to Latin America without crossing U.S. airspace, unless you went the long way around, right? And so then you do this and you have to go, it's a very short list. What are the non-extradition countries to get from Hong Kong all the way over to South America? And again, it's just building a bridge through the air step by step. And, my whole flight manifest at this point has been made public. There were journalists on the flight that I was ticketed for from Moscow to Havana, taking pictures of my empty seat when I was prevented from boarding. And so, yeah, this has all been looked into. And it's just, to me, it's frustrating, but it's also interesting because I wonder, if they did this intentionally, if they did this strategically, it was really the most brilliant move they made in terms of communications planning that they could have. I'm not sure we can give them that much credit because it very well could have been a moment of panic. But it is, I think, disappointing that all these years later, they still haven't rectified it.
And it didn't work out well for you. Obama commuted Chelsea Manning's sentence. She's now running for political office. Politicians say you should be killed.
Yeah. Well, the funny thing is we see that much less now than we did in 2013. The reality is there's sort of a pardon movement going on my behalf. I have not asked for pardon from this president or the prior president, but many others have on my behalf, and I'm tremendously grateful for that and the advocacy that people have brought forward. But excuse me. The thing is, as each year passes, and all of those claims, as you said, they were like, oh, he got people killed. There were agents, there were programs or whatever. All this stuff fell apart. It didn't work. Attacks are going to get through. None of it came to pass. And this was exactly the story in the Manning case. Obama could not have commuted Manning's sentence politically, realistically, in this 2013 era, in this 2014 era. But years after, right, when Manning's actions were actually in 2009, 2010, you start getting year after year after year, the fact that what Manning did not harm national security in a material way. It did not harm individuals' lives and livelihood in a material way. All it did is inform the public and embarrass the U.S. government and its partner governments in the case of diplomatic cables. But largely, it was about reputational harm, right? The government had egg on its face, and it retaliates as a result of this. Moreover, from reporting on the justice system in other contexts, I think, the government is very interested in what it describes as the deterrent effect. Manning becomes secondary, right? Someone like me or Ellsberg or Drake, any of these people, they become secondary to the point of the government pointing to the rest of their workforce. Even if this person did the right thing, even if they did it carefully, even if they did it in the best way, we don't want you to emulate it. So we are going to come after this person, chase them all the way around the earth in order to set an example.
I hope you get pardoned. It's a little puzzling. The Attorney General says you're a traitor, and the information you peddled, you peddled it around like a commercial merchant.
Yeah.
Which you didn't do. You never tried to get money from it. President Trump in 2013 said they got a lot of information out of this guy. He's a terrible guy who set our country back.
This guy's a bad guy. And, there is still a thing called execution.
This is a bad guy, and there's still a thing called execution. But then 7 years later, a reporter asks him, do you want to give Edward Snowden a pardon? And he says, well, I'm going to look into it.
Do you want to give Edward Snowden a pardon?
Well, I'm going to look at it. I mean, I'm not that aware of the Snowden situation, but I'm going to start looking at it.
Yeah, this is a good example of the distance Donald Trump has traveled from 2013 Trump to 2020 Trump. But also, more generally, when you bring up the case of the Attorney General, who does not seem familiar at all with the basic facts of the case when he's speaking publicly on it, that is a lot of distance historically. A lot of things have happened in between then. And as we start to look at what happened in 2013, less with the heat of the moment and sort of careers on the line, and more dispassionately from a historic context, I think it's clearer and clearer that what I did was the right thing to do. And in fact, public opinion is swinging very heavily toward that side. And in fact, even elite opinion, which is largely turned against individuals working outside of the organization in this kind of way. You will not find a lot of love for whistleblowers in corporate America, in government agencies, in any country in the world, I think. But even there, you are beginning to see people speak in fact, I would say large majority terms, favorably rather than disfavorably. And I think that's because history has a way of exonerating the truth.
In some ways, attitudes switched the other way. President-elect Biden, before he became vice president, was against this spying, this data collection, and said, it's very intrusive. We're going to trust the president and vice president to do the right thing. Don't count me in on that.
The real question here is, what do they do with this information that they collect that does not have anything to do with al-Qaeda? And we're going to trust the president and the vice president of the United States that they're doing the right thing. Don't count me in on that.
But he changed his tune once he was in power.
Yeah, and again, this was the same for President-elect Barack Obama.
Some people say, well, Obama was this raving liberal before, now he's, Dick Cheney.
He tells this very briefly in his memoir. He said, yeah, he was campaigning against mass surveillance. Yeah, it was wrong. Yeah, it shouldn't have been done. It was a problem, so on and so forth. But then he says, after he became president, he realized he was seeing that from the cheap seats. And now Bush's wars were his wars. And this is very in line with his decision to move from investigating Bush-era abuses, things like torture, things like unlawful killing, things like the massive domestic surveillance program that happened under the Bush administration. He didn't investigate them at all. Instead, he said it was important that we look forward, not backwards. And it's this lack of accountability amongst the American political elite. At the same time, we are constantly increasing the level of accountability for ordinary members of the public, right? Particularly when we talk in the context of this mass surveillance. Not only is the government policing you, Twitter is policing you, what you say online. YouTube is locking your channel, whatever. There are people in little police hats everywhere you look. And at the same time, these people with power are excusing their behavior. They are heightening the standard of accountability to which we are held. And to me, I say, isn't this backwards, right? We used to call them public servants, and we were private citizens because we were supposed to know everything about them, and we were all supposed to scrutinize them. And we were private citizens because no one was supposed to know what we were doing. We had no power, we had no influence, and so we were meant to be left alone. But that is increasingly being inverted, and we are under a constant gaze electronically. At the same time, they are permanently sheltered by this fog of unaccountability, and that's by design.
And just to be clear, Twitter and YouTube can't put us in jail.
Yeah, they can't, well, yet, but stay tuned.